The ghost in the helix. The day the Viking myth died. The image is burned into our collective consciousness. A towering figure stands against a backdrop of gray, churning waves. He has hair the color of sun-bleached straw, eyes as blue as a frozen fjord, and muscles forged by a lifetime of rowing and raiding. We've seen him in Hollywood blockbusters, in comic books, and on the logos of sports teams. We thought we knew him. We thought his blood was pure, his lineage as straight as the edge of a Norse broadsword. But what if I told you that the man we've been imagining for centuries never actually existed? What if the pure Scandinavian warrior is a ghost, a phantom created by Victorian romanticism and reinforced by modern media? For the last 6 years, a silent revolution has been brewing in the laboratories of Copenhagen and Stockholm. It didn't start with a Viking war cry, but with the soft hum of a DNA sequencing machine. Scientists have finally managed to crack the code of the ancient dead, and what they found buried in the marrow of over 4 Viking skeletons is turning our history books into fiction. The truth isn't just different, it's stranger, darker, and far more diverse than any legend ever dared to suggest. Before we sail further into the fog of the past and uncover the secrets hidden for a millennium, if you're a fan of uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It truly helps our longship reach new horizons and brings more of these forgotten stories to light. The woman who changed everything. The unraveling of the myth began in a quiet burial site in Varnhem, Sweden. Archaeologists had discovered the remains of a woman they named Kata. To the naked eye, she was a typical Viking. She was buried with the honors of her culture, her bones resting in the earth of a land we consider the very heart of the Viking world. The expectation was simple. Kata's DNA would be the gold standard of Scandinavian genetics. It would show the world exactly what a real Viking looked like. But when the results flickered onto the computer screens, the room went silent. Kata wasn't what they expected. Her genetic markers didn't scream Nordic blonde. In fact, they whispered something else entirely. The data revealed a complex tapestry of ancestry that stretched far beyond the borders of Sweden. And she wasn't an outlier. As the scientists expanded their study to 442 skeletons, found from Greenland to the shores of Italy, the blonde warrior stereotype began to crumble like dry parchment. The mosaic of the North. We have long viewed the Vikings as a homogeneous race, a single, united group of people who shared the same blood, the same look, and the same destiny. We imagined them as a biological monolith. Professor Eski Willerslev, the visionary leader of this massive project, realized very quickly that this was a fundamental misunderstanding. The DNA evidence proved, with cold and clinical certainty, that the Viking world was a genetic melting pot. The skeletons told a story of movement that defies modern logic. These weren't just people from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden socializing within their own small circles. Their genetic makeup was a wild, swirling mix of influences. To the shock of the research team, they found genetic markers from Southern Europe and even Asia deeply embedded in the Viking gene pool. But here is the most striking part. This wasn't just the result of Vikings bringing back captives from their raids. The data suggests that this genetic blending had been happening before the Viking Age even began. Scandinavia, far from being a remote, frozen island of genetic purity, was actually a central hub. It was a place where the world met, mingled, and merged. The job title, not the bloodline. If the Vikings weren't a single race, then what were they? This is where the discovery gets truly provocative. The DNA evidence forces us to redefine the very word Viking. For centuries, we believed being a Viking was something you were born into. You were born Norse. Therefore, you were a Viking. But the bones tell a different story. The genetic diversity found in these graves suggests that Viking wasn't an ethnic identity. It was a job. It was an occupation, a lifestyle, a choice. It was something you did, not something you were. This realization changes the entire power dynamic of the medieval world. It implies that the Viking expansion wasn't just a tribal migration, it was a social movement. It was a franchise that anyone, regardless of their bloodline, could join if they had the skill, the courage, and the will to row. Imagine a world where a man from the Scottish Highlands or a trader from the Caspian Sea could look at the success of the Norsemen, their ships, their wealth, their fearsome reputation, and say, I want to be part of that. And the Vikings, ever the pragmatists, would look at him and ask one simple question: can you fight? The darkness in the DNA. However, this story of integration and diversity has a much darker side. While some joined the Viking world by choice, others were forced into it, and many met a brutal end that the DNA is only now beginning to recount. In the next part of our journey, we will travel to the coast of England, where a mass grave of headless men holds a terrifying secret about what happened when the Viking dream turned into a nightmare. We will see how these warriors weren't just brothers in arms, but a collection of mercenaries from across the continent, bound together not by family, but by a mission that ended in a slaughter. The shift from a genetic identity to a cultural one isn't just a modern academic theory. It is etched into the very soil of the British Isles, often in the most violent ways imaginable. To truly understand how someone became a Viking without being born one, we have to look at a mystery that lay buried for 1,000 years beneath the rolling hills of Dorset, England. In 2009, during the construction of a new relief road, workers stumbled upon a pit that would freeze the blood of even the most seasoned archaeologist. It was a mass grave containing approximately 50 skeletons. But as the dirt was brushed away, a terrifying pattern emerged. Every single body was missing its head. This was no ordinary war grave where soldiers were buried where they fell. The marks on the neck bones told a story of a cold, calculated sequence of events. These men had been captured, stripped, and tied up. They were then forced to stand in a row and were executed one by one, with the killing strokes delivered from the front in a display of absolute ruthlessness. For a long time, it was assumed these were local Anglo-Saxons massacred by Viking raiders. But DNA analysis performed as part of this massive 6-year study flipped the script. These headless men were the Vikings. They were authentic Scandinavian raiders who had likely failed in their mission and were executed by the local forces they sought to conquer. Yet the most revealing detail wasn't their tragic end, but their origin. The DNA showed that these 50 men were not from the same village, the same valley, or even the same family. They were a diverse group recruited from various parts of the Viking world based on their specific skills and loyalty. They operated less like a national army and more like a pirate crew or a modern private military company. This confirms a massive trend in the research. The Viking world was an adaptable system that brought together fighters from different regions to achieve a common, often high-stakes goal. While the Dorset site shows the consequence of failure, a discovery in the Orkney Islands of Scotland reveals the ultimate success of the Viking brand. Researchers examined 2 skeletons buried with meticulous care and high status. They were laid to rest in boat-like burials, a sacred Norse custom designed to carry the soul to the halls of Valhalla. They were buried with Viking swords, the ultimate symbol of a Norse warrior's identity. For decades, historians were certain these were Scandinavian invaders who had settled in Scotland. The DNA results, however, were a total shock. These Norse warriors had absolutely zero Scandinavian ancestry. Not a single drop of blood linked them to Norway, Denmark, or Sweden. Instead, they were genetically tied to the local populations of Ireland and Scotland, possibly descendants of the Picts, the very people the Vikings were supposed to be fighting. This is the smoking gun of the new historical narrative. These men weren't Vikings by birth. They were Vikings by choice. They had witnessed the arrival of the Norsemen and were so impressed by their technology, their ships, and their sheer social momentum that they decided to join them. They adopted the language, the tools, the religion, and even the burial customs of their former enemies. Being a Viking was an identity you could put on like a suit of armor. It was a cultural influence that spread like a powerful idea, embraced by those who recognized its strength. This completely dismantles the traditional view of the Viking Age as a simple battle between us and them, between attacker and defender. The boundaries were fluid. The Viking world was a meritocracy where if you could row, if you could fight, and if you were loyal to the group's objectives, the gates of Valhalla were open to you regardless of your DNA. But as the Viking influence pushed west into the Atlantic, another, even more mysterious branch of the Norse family was looking in the opposite direction. While the Danes were meeting their end in English execution pits, the Swedes were carving a path through the vast river networks of the East. And it is there, in the heart of Russia and the markets of Baghdad, that the Viking story takes its most exotic and genetically surprising turn. The River Kings and the Silk Road. While the Viking expansion into the West was often defined by the clash of steel and the burning of monasteries, the story unfolding in the East was one of unprecedented commerce and cultural fusion. As the Danes and Norwegians looked toward the Atlantic, the Swedish Vikings turned their prows toward the Baltic Sea, seeking not just plunder, but the keys to the world's most lucrative trade networks. These were the River Kings. Using their specialized longships, they didn't just hug the coastlines. They ventured deep into the heart of the continent, navigating the expansive and often treacherous river systems of present-day Russia and Ukraine. They mastered the Dnieper and the Volga, turning these massive waterways into liquid highways that connected the cold forests of the north to the glittering markets of the ancient world. As these Swedish explorers pushed further south, they adopted a new name for themselves, the Rus. This simple name would eventually evolve into the modern name Russia, and genetic research has confirmed a long-debated historical theory. The early rulers of these vast lands were indeed of Viking descent. This wasn't a simple conquest. It was a political and genetic metamorphosis that reshaped the map of Europe forever. The Asian connection, a globalized Middle Age. The most startling revelation from the DNA sequencing of Viking Age skeletons isn't just that they moved through these lands, but that they brought the East home with them. In Viking burial sites across Scandinavia, scientists have discovered an unexpected genetic footprint, Asian DNA. For centuries, history books painted Scandinavia as a remote, frozen frontier, isolated from the sophisticated empires of the East. The genetics prove otherwise. The presence of these markers suggests that the Viking world was much more interconnected than anyone had imagined. This blending was facilitated by the Silk Road, the historic trade route that moved silk, spices, and silver from China to the Mediterranean. The Vikings positioned themselves at the western frontier of this global network. They didn't just trade with merchants from Central Asia and the steppe populations, they integrated them. The bustling markets of Kiev became true melting pots where Viking fur traders stood side by side with Arab silversmiths and nomadic merchants from the east. These individuals didn't just exchange goods. They married into Viking families, lived in Viking settlements and became part of the Norse community. Hybrid vigor and the secret of the berserkers. This genetic mixing has led researchers to a provocative new theory regarding the most feared figures in Norse history, the berserkers. These were the warriors said to enter a trance-like rage during battle, fighting with superhuman strength and an utter indifference to pain. While traditional explanations have pointed toward the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, some scientists now look to the concept of hybrid vigor. When two distinct and hardy populations intermingle, such as the robust Scandinavian body type and the resilient nomadic populations of the Asian steppes, new and exceptional physical characteristics can emerge. The combination of these diverse lineages may have contributed to the unique physical capabilities, exceptional endurance, and terrifying strength of the Viking warrior class. The Norse strength we celebrate in myth may actually have been derived from a diverse blend of human genes, a biological advantage forged in the crucible of global migration. Guardians of the Golden Horn. But the journey of the Swedish Vikings didn't end in the river markets of the Rus. Their ambition drove them even further south to the greatest city of the era, Constantinople. There, the Viking reputation for ferocity and loyalty earned them a place at the very top of the social hierarchy as the Varangian Guard. The Byzantine emperor, wary of the political scheming of his own local soldiers, chose these Northmen as his elite personal protectors. They were famous for their massive axes, their imposing stature, and their absolute focus on the gold they were paid. These guards lived for years in a city that was the center of the world, rubbing shoulders with Greeks, Turks, Africans, and Asians. When these warriors eventually returned to their northern homes, they didn't come alone. They brought back families, culture, and Southern European DNA. The genetic evidence shows that this southern influence in Scandinavia wasn't the result of an invasion from the south, but rather a deliberate bringing of the world back to the north, the ghost of the North Atlantic. While the Swedish Vikings were integrating with the empires of the east, their Norwegian cousins were looking toward a horizon that most of the medieval world believed was the edge of the existence. They were driven by a hunger for land and a restless spirit that pushed them further into the mist of the North Atlantic than any European had ever dared. For decades, the story of Vikings in America was treated as a collection of colorful myths. But the cold, hard evidence of archaeology and the invisible ink of DNA are now proving that the Norse reach was far more extensive than we ever suspected. The Sunstone, navigating the impossible. The primary question that has haunted historians for generations is simple. How did they do it? How did these sailors navigate thousands of miles of open, unpredictable sea without a magnetic compass? The answer might lie in a piece of advanced ancient technology called the Sunstone. These were specialized crystals, likely calcite or Iceland spar, that had the unique ability to detect polarized light. By looking through the stone, a navigator could locate the exact position of the sun even on heavily overcast days, or when the sun had dipped just below the horizon. This wasn't magic, but a sophisticated application of scientific principles that allowed the Vikings to maintain a straight course across the whale road of the Atlantic. Armed with this optical edge and a genetic predisposition for endurance, they pushed toward the sunset. Vinland. More than a footnote. We know for a scientific certainty that the Vikings reached Newfoundland. The archaeological site at Lonso Meadows stands as an undeniable monument to their arrival in North America, roughly 5 centuries before Columbus. However, the latest research suggests that this settlement wasn't meant to be a permanent colony. Instead, it functioned as a strategic outpost, a place for repairing ships and gathering timber before continuing the journey even further south or west. This raises a provocative possibility. How much of the American coast did they actually see? Across various regions of the Americas, legends persist of fair-skinned, bearded strangers who arrived from the sea long before the Spanish conquest. While these stories were once dismissed as mere folklore, the revelation of the Vikings' extreme genetic diversity is making scholars reconsider. If the Vikings were a multicultural franchise capable of bringing Asian genes to Scandinavia, could they have left European traces in the heart of the Americas? While clear Viking traits haven't been widely identified in pre-Columbian Native American remains yet, researchers believe we may simply be looking in the wrong locations or that the evidence is waiting to be uncovered. The Icelandic smoking gun, lineage, C1E. Perhaps the most concrete evidence of the Viking-American connection isn't found in the soil of the New World, but in the blood of the Old. In Iceland, geneticists have stumbled upon a biological anomaly that has sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They discovered a specific genetic lineage known as C1E. This marker is virtually non-existent in Europe, but it is a hallmark of Native American and Asian populations. What makes this discovery world-changing is the timeline. This DNA didn't arrive in Iceland during the modern era. The evidence suggests it entered the Icelandic gene pool approximately 1,000 years ago. The most logical explanation is as cinematic as any Norse saga. Around the year 1000, a Viking ship returning from the shores of North America didn't just bring back timber and grapes. They brought back a person, most likely a Native American woman, who integrated into Icelandic society. Her DNA survived through the centuries, a silent genetic witness to a transatlantic encounter that history almost forgot. To the Amazon and beyond? As we peel back the layers of the Viking story, the theories become even more daring. Some researchers point to ancient South American depictions of bearded men as a possible link to Norse travelers. Given the Vikings' unparalleled mastery of river navigation, the same skills they used to reach Baghdad, the idea of them exploring the Amazon River seems less like a fantasy and more like a logical extension of their capabilities. We have consistently underestimated the Vikings in the past. We didn't believe they had Asian genes, yet they did. We didn't believe they were a multi-ethnic collective, yet they were. If being a Viking was a franchise open to anyone with the skill to survive, the idea of their influence reaching the deep interior of the Americas becomes a conversation worth having. The Eastern Path, the River Kings of the Rus, while the longships of the Danes and Norwegians were battering the monastery walls of Northumbria and the mist-covered cliffs of Ireland, a different kind of Viking saga was unfolding in the East. This was not a story of sudden coastal raids, but of a slow, deep, and transformative penetration into the heart of a continent. The Swedish Vikings, looking across the Baltic Sea, saw not just land to plunder, but a network of liquid highways that could lead them to the very source of the world's wealth. These warriors and traders utilized their specialized longships to traverse the Baltic, but their true genius lay in their mastery of the extensive river systems of present-day Russia and Ukraine. These were not narrow streams, but expansive, teeming waterways that served as the arteries of the ancient world. By sailing down the Dnieper and the Volga, the Swedish Vikings bypassed the traditional boundaries of Europe and reached the frontiers of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. As they settled along these banks, they adopted a new identity that would echo through the centuries. They became known as the Rus. This name, which would eventually evolve into the modern name Russia, was born from a fusion of Norse ambition and the local cultures they integrated with. Recent genetic research has provided the final proof for a long-standing historical debate. The early rulers of Russia were indeed of Viking descent. They were not merely invaders. They were architects of a new geopolitical reality, reshaping the genetic and political map of Eastern Europe forever. The Silk Road and the Asian Blueprint. The most startling revelation of the modern DNA study is the clear presence of Asian genetic markers within Viking Age skeletons found in Scandinavia. For a long time, the frozen north was thought to be a genetic cul-de-sac. The DNA proves it was actually a vibrant terminus for the Silk Road. This historic trade route, stretching from the borders of China to the Mediterranean, moved more than just spices, silk, and silver. It moved people and their genetic codes. The Vikings positioned themselves as the Western power brokers of this network. Genetic evidence confirms that individuals from the East, likely from the Central Asian steppes and early predecessors of Mongol tribes, did not just trade with the Vikings, they lived among them. They integrated into Viking society through marriage and shared commerce, becoming permanent members of the community. In the sprawling markets of Kiev, a Viking fur trader might stand alongside an Arab merchant or a traveler from the Caspian Sea. These locations were the ultimate melting pots of the medieval world, where cultural and family lineages blended in a way that modern science is only now beginning to untangle. This interconnectedness suggests that the Viking world was a precursor to our modern globalized society, where distance was no barrier to the flow of DNA. The biological edge, hybrid vigor, and the berserkers. This blending of disparate populations leads to one of the most provocative theories in modern biohistory: the origin of the berserker. In Norse legend, these were the elite warriors who fought in a state of absolute trance, feeling no pain and possessing strength that seemed to transcend human limits. While popular culture often blames hallucinogenic mushrooms, scientists are now looking at the genetics of the Viking melting pot. When two distinct and hardy populations intermingle, such as the robust Scandinavian hunters and the resilient nomadic warriors of the Asian steppes, a phenomenon known as hybrid vigor can occur. This genetic mixture can result in unique physical characteristics, including exceptional endurance, bone density, and muscle response. The fearsome strength of the Viking warrior may not have been a product of pure Norse blood, but rather the exact opposite. It was the diversity of their genes, gathered from the far reaches of the East and South, that may have provided the biological advantage necessary to dominate the battlefields of Europe for 300 years. The Emperor's Shadow. The Varangian Guard nowhere was this diversity more visible than in the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, seeking protectors who were removed from local political conspiracies, looked to the north for his elite personal security. He hired the Vikings to form the Varangian Guard. These men were famous across the Mediterranean for their massive axes and their unwavering loyalty to the gold that paid them. Stationed at the Golden Horn, these Vikings lived in the most cosmopolitan city on earth, surrounded by Greeks, Turks, Africans, and Persians. They served for decades, and when they finally returned to their northern homelands, they brought back more than just Byzantine treasure. The genetic traces of Southern European DNA found in ancient Scandinavian graves are a direct legacy of this service. These were not genes brought by invaders from the south, but brought home by returning Norsemen who had started families in the sun-drenched streets of the Mediterranean. By the height of the Viking Age, Scandinavia had become a hub of international interaction, its people carrying the genetic signatures of a world they had successfully traveled and claimed as their own. Echoes of the gods, the genetic mythos. When we look beyond the physical remains, the story of the Viking Age becomes even more complex, bleeding into the realm of the supernatural. For centuries, the sagas of Norse mythology were dismissed as mere bedtime stories or symbolic poetry. However, the latest genetic breakthroughs suggest that these ancient tales might be a shrouded record of a real historical and genetic collision. At the center of Norse belief lies a titanic war between two different sets of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir, led by the heavy-handed Odin and the thunderous Thor, represent war, military strength, and rigid power. In contrast, the Vanir, deities like Freyr and Freya, are deeply connected to the earth, fertility, nature, and the cycles of growth. In the legends, these two groups fight a war that seems destined to destroy the world, but it concludes in an unexpected way, through integration and the exchange of hostages. Historians are now asking a radical question. Could the Vanir represent the original inhabitants of Scandinavia, those with ancestors from southern Europe who lived in harmony with the land? And could the Aesir symbolize the aggressive, migratory groups who brought the ancestry of the Asian steppe into the north? If this is true, then Norse mythology is not just a collection of fables. It is a genetic memory of the moment two worlds collided and merged to form the Viking identity. The War of the Gods was actually the War of the Genes, and the resulting pantheon was a mirror of the diverse society the Vikings were building on the ground. The closing of the North. Why the diversity vanished. Every empire has its autumn, and for the Viking franchise, the season changed with startling speed. By approximately the year 1050, the dynamic, swirling exchange of genes and cultures that had defined the era began to slow to a crawl. The melting pot of Scandinavia, which had been boiling for centuries, was suddenly taken off the fire. The genetic evidence shows a sharp decrease in the introduction of new DNA into the region. The borders of the Viking world, once as fluid as the tides, began to freeze into place. But why? The reasons were not biological, but systemic. As the chaotic, meritocratic raiding culture matured, it gave way to the stability of centralized power. The separate nations of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway began to form, creating rigid political boundaries where before there had been only open sea and opportunity. However, the most powerful force in closing the Viking world was the rise of the Church. Christianity brought with it a new set of laws and social norms that directly attacked the engines of Viking diversity. The Church discouraged the raiding and the vast slave trade that had been responsible for bringing individuals from southern Europe, Asia, and the British Isles into the Scandinavian gene pool. What was once an open, adaptive society became a restricted and fortified collection of kingdoms. The Viking lifestyle, that unique blend of global travel, cultural mixing, and merit-based success, simply lost its appeal in the face of a more stable, predictable, and restricted medieval world. The invisible legacy, a warrior in the office. The end of the Viking Age did not mean the death of the Viking people. Their genetic material did not evaporate. It simply went underground, flowing through the generations like a hidden river. When scientists compared the DNA of ancient skeletons to modern populations, they found that the Viking legacy is staggeringly pervasive. If you are currently living in the United Kingdom, there is a 6% chance that you carry considerable Viking genes in your blood. That represents millions of people today, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, who carry a physical piece of the North Sea within their own cells. In Sweden, the percentage is even higher, with roughly 10% of the population showing distinct Viking genetic markers. Yet, the most surprising find is that modern Scandinavians are not the same as ancient Vikings. Over the last 1,000 years, the gene pool has continued to evolve and merge. The specific, vibrant cocktail of genetics that characterized the Viking era, that unique mix of Nordic, Asian, and Southern European DNA, has diminished or changed into something entirely new. This proves that history is never frozen. The Vikings were a moment in time, a flash of globalized energy that forever altered the human story before blending back into the fabric of the world they helped create. The genetic mirror. Who are the Vikings today? The culmination of this 6-year scientific odyssey didn't just stay in the dusty basements of museums or the sterile environments of laboratories. The scientists involved in this massive project took a bold step. They compared the extracted ancient Viking DNA directly with the genetic makeup of modern populations. Their objective was both simple and profound: to see how much of that restless, seafaring spirit still flows through our veins after 1,000 years of migration, industrialization, and global change. The results are nothing short of a revelation for our understanding of modern identity. The Viking next door. If you are currently living in the United Kingdom, the chances are high that you are walking through life with a silent partner in your genome. The research indicates that as many as 6% of UK residents possess a considerable amount of Viking genetic material. This means that for millions of people, the Whale Road and the Longships are not just stories from a history book. They are a biological reality. You could be a teacher, a doctor, or an office worker, and yet, a piece of the North Sea is etched into your very DNA. In Sweden, the numbers are even more striking, with about 10% of the population carrying distinct Viking genetic markers. However, this number also brings with it a surprising twist. Many people expect that modern Scandinavians are the perfect, unchanged replicas of their Viking ancestors. But the science tells a different story. The gene pool has shifted significantly over the last millennium. Modern Scandinavians are not the same as the Vikings of the 9th century. The distinct genetic characteristics, that unique cocktail of Nordic, Southern European, and Asian influences, have evolved, merged, and in some cases, diminished as time marched on. The death of the pure ancestry. Myth. Perhaps the most culturally significant impact of this research is the absolute destruction of the idea of genetic purity. For far too long, the image of the Viking has been weaponized by groups seeking to promote a fantasy of a pure, blonde race. Science has now provided the ultimate counter-argument: diversity as strength. The Vikings were successful, not because they kept to themselves, but because they were genetically diverse and mixed. A culture of integration. They embraced new cultures, adopted foreign technologies, and welcomed new DNA into their families wherever they traveled. The resilience of the blend. Their incredible resilience and ability to conquer vast territories came from their diversity, not from uniformity. When we look at the remains in Orkney or the mass graves in Dorset, we see a Viking world that was more like a global franchise than a closed ethnic group. It was an identity based on involvement and skill. If you could row, if you could fight, and if you shared the group's objectives, you were a Viking, regardless of whether your ancestors came from the fjords of Norway or the hills of Scotland. The sudden silence. The research also uncovered a mysterious genetic sunset. Around the year 1050, the vibrant, chaotic mixing of genes that defined the era came to a sudden halt. The borders of the Viking world, both physical and genetic, began to harden. Several factors likely played a role in this closing of the North. The spread of Christianity. The church brought new norms that discouraged the raiding and slave trading, which had facilitated much of the earlier genetic mixing. Centralized power. The rise of powerful, structured kingdoms in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway replaced the fluid, meritocratic raiding crews with rigid national boundaries. Fortification. Lands that were once open and accessible became restricted and fortified, ending the era of free genetic and cultural movement. Conclusion: the living legacy. The Viking era may have ended 1,000 years ago, but its impact is immortal. The Vikings served as the great mediators of the medieval world, connecting distant continents and cultures long before the invention of modern communication. They were a bridge between East and West, between the ancient world and the modern one. We now know that the stereotypical blonde warrior was only a small part of a much larger, darker, and more complex picture. The true Viking was a cosmopolitan traveler, a skilled professional, and a member of a remarkably open society that valued ability over bloodlines. As we look at our own world today, increasingly interconnected and constantly changing, we can finally see the Vikings for who they truly were. Not a ghost of a pure past, but a reflection of our globalized future. Their story is not just written in stone and saga, but in the very helix of our DNA, waiting to be rediscovered by every new generation. If you found this journey through the hidden codes of our ancestors as fascinating as we have, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support allows us to continue digging deeper into the mysteries of history and bringing the truth to light. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.